Okay, the last part of fiscal policy, we're going to talk about budgets. Right? Now we know about our household budget, we're all good at that. We get the paycheck, we got to pay our bills, and hopefully we have enough money left over to have fun with, or at least to buy food and stuff like that. So this is kind of where we're heading for it. But instead of looking at the household budget, we're going to be looking at the government budget. We're going to be looking at what the government brings in. Remember we did that on the first class lecture. We talked about the revenues, income tax, payroll tax, all that kind of stuff, and government spending, what we spend it on. Medicare, Medicaid, military, all the other government programs, that kind of stuff. And if we need more, which we've needed more for almost the past 20 years, we have to raise taxes and or borrow more money. Borrow more money, the debt goes up. Raising taxes, people get ticked off. All right, so here takes a look at what we brought in 2018 and what we spent. 2018, our GDP was 16.5%. And that brought in revenues, or taxes and fees and all that kind of stuff, of $3.3 trillion. Of which, this part here went to Medicare, or excuse me, this was the individual income tax. Here's the payroll tax. Here's the corporate taxes, and here's all the other stuff. Okay? Now, what did we spend it on? Well, that mandatory spending. Okay, that's the spending that we said was non-discretionary. We didn't spend it. 12.5% or excuse me, 12.5% of our GDP. Actually, it's 62.5%. But $2.5 trillion. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and that's kind of the big part here. So our GDP was 20.3%. Spending was 12.5 of that. 4.1 trillion is what we spent. So we already have a problem. 4.1 trillion we spent, 3.3 trillion we brought in. So this is the stuff that's going up and we have to spend no matter what. There's the interest on our debt. So that's the 325 billion there. Now the numbers are a little different if you start remembering what we did from last semester, because different places have rounding things different. And remember, we're talking about macroeconomics, and so we're talking about big rounding errors. But the discretionary spending was $1.3 trillion. So 1.3 trillion, that's where we're trying to reduce spending to get rid of our debt. This 2.5 trillion, it just keeps getting bigger. As does our net interest keeps getting bigger, because we have to keep borrowing money because we continue to spend more than we bring in. So in this particular budget, we'd have to borrow $500 billion. Now, remember, as we take a look at this, here's that part in 2018. This is by law, we have to spend that money. Boom, it's got to be spent. We have to pay the interest or we'll go bankrupt and nobody will loan us any money ever again, and we become like Greece. These two, here's where Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Attorney General, Secretary of Interior, all these things that the government does falls into this category, and they're self-defense and military. This is the discretionary spending, and that's what we're looking to do. All this stuff comes with it. Now, we have to go ahead and look at two things and make sure everybody understands the difference between debt and deficit. So we start with revenues. That's the money we get. And then we go ahead and look at expenditures. That's the money we spend. This is where we're looking at whether we have a deficit or a surplus, right? This one goes ahead and again, this shows us, remember that little itty-bitty part, that 1/3 of the government budget that we're trying to pay down the debt on? Well, this breaks that down a little bit more. Here's the Secretary of Defense. Here's all the other departments in the government. You go, well, gee, why don't we just go ahead and pay down cut the defense in half and use that to pay down the debt? Well, we actually tried that once when the Soviet Union passed away, and we said there was this word called a peace dividend. We decided we didn't need the big military anymore because we don't have the Soviet Union anymore. But instead of using that money to pay down the debt, what did we do? We found other ways to spend it. So again, Nancy Pelosi once said, and I love Nancy Pelosi because she gives really good one-liners for examples. And she said, we do not have a spending problem in the United States. What we have is we have a revenue generating problem. So in other words, we're not taxing enough. Okay? But that was her statement. I am not kidding. You can go back, check it on YouTube, whatever. She sent this, let me see. Her previous speakership is when she said that. We don't have a spending problem, we have a revenue generating problem. All right, now, in 2015, thinking about this revenue generating versus spending problem, we spent this much money out of every dollar on Medicare and Medicaid. It increased. We spent this much on Social Security. It increased. We spent this much on other benefits. Let me see. Income security, and it says and other benefits. Well, that one actually went down a little bit. National defense, it went down as a percentage of our GDP. And then, of course, the interest on the loan, and then everything else. So as you can see, the problem is from these 3 years, the percentage of entitlements went from 49% to 52%. And our GDP rose about $3 or $4 trillion during that time frame. So the money was even more than that percentage. But we definitely have to get this under control before we try to figure out how we're going to go ahead and look at the debt that we have. And again, some of you say, oh, you must be this, that, or something else because you want to get rid of entitlements. No, I don't want to get rid of entitlements. But when you get to the end of the chapter and we talk about the Social Security Medicare paper, you'll see why this is not sustainable. In other words, a lot of you graduating this college, by the time you retire, this won't be here for you. All right. So, can taxes become a disincentive to work? Now I want you to go back to that first handout, the government problem and concerns one, because in there is something called the Laffer curve. Now this guy's still alive, he's an economist, and he actually came up with a model that at some tax rate from 0 to 100, people will stop working because they don't want to pay that taxes. Here's the key. Somewhere between 50 to 100% that kicks in. But it kicks in differently from different people. So that's why when we take a look at prohibitive tax range, we can't say this is it, because every person has their own, I'm tired of working and paying this much in taxes, so I just quit. Or I won't take the raise, or I won't do this, or I won't do that. And what that does, however, is instead of expanding our economy, it starts decreasing our economy or doesn't let it expand as much as it could because people are opting out and not going to work. And one of the things about the Affordable Care Act is, and this is according to the Congressional Budget Office, is that it actually gave 2.5 million workers a disincentive not to work. Okay? Remember, 1,600 pages of stuff that we didn't really, nobody had a chance to read it all. As a matter of fact, we can bring up Nancy Pelosi again. She said we have to pass it to see what's in it. Now, here's where we go back to something I said earlier. We vote those people in office to do a job. They're supposed to pass laws to make life better for us. That's why we put them in there. Which means they should be reading the bill and they should be reading the economic impact summary of the bill before they vote on it, not the other way around. So, debt and deficit. We hear more about the deficit than we ever do about the debt. As a matter of fact, during our coronavirus stint here, nobody's mentioning the debt. As a matter of fact, we're blowing it out of the water. You know, we just passed a $2.2 trillion stimulus plan, and that was phase 3, which means we already did a phase 1 and a phase 2, and Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump are talking about a phase 4. Spend, 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 spend. May work, may not work, we'll see. But the point is we see the deficit, but the debt is huge and it's underlying the deficit, but they get confused. Deficit / surplus for the current year. That's what we either have a deficit or a surplus for that year. Now, let me give you an example. In the year 2010, and these are real numbers, we brought in 1.8 trillion, we spent 3.2 trillion. We had a deficit of $1.4 trillion. So this went up a lot because of this. Because all the deficit is year after year after year just adding up the deficits and surpluses. Now, 2008, I use it as an example, okay, because we didn't have a surplus in 2008. But let's assume this was our first year that the country was even in being. So at the end of our first year that the government was there, we had $200 billion left over of taxes that we paid to the government. Now ideally, they should give that back to us because that's our money. But let's just say they hold on to it, so that's a surplus. So they have $200 billion in their bank account. 2009, we had a deficit of $1.1 trillion. So the first thing we do is we empty out our bank account of $200 billion, and we have $900 billion that we had to borrow. So we now have a $900 billion debt. In 2010, we had a deficit of $1.4 trillion. Adding that on to the debt of already $900 billion, we now come up with $2.3 trillion. Okay? So you can see how the deficits and the surpluses, all we do is add them together, and that gives us our debt, and it continues to run. In 2011, it went up. In 2012, it went up. It's gone up every year. It's going up this year. So that's what we look at. So this is what this sheet should look like then. There's the Laffer curve all filled in, and there's our debt and deficit part filled in. All right, so what I want you to do right now is I want you to take a look at this. Just grab out a sheet of paper, and I want you to let me know what the deficit and debt is, considering this is the first year of our country, and second, third, and fourth. But we started out with a debt of $500 billion. So go do that, pause the machine, and then come on back. Okay, now that you're back, we had a surplus, a deficit, a deficit, and a deficit. And notice, surplus was good, but the deficit's bad, but the deficit's going down. But our debt, we started at 500, we went to 200, that's good, but then it went up, and it went up, and it went up. Now here is where some of those talking heads on TV try to tell you things are getting better. Because what they're going to say is, look, we're doing good, the deficit is getting better and better and better. But they'll leave out the fact that the debt is increasing. We went from $600 billion to $1.1 trillion. They'll leave that part out because that doesn't work with what they're trying to nudge us to do. Because unfortunately, most of our news agencies anymore, they don't just give us the facts like, here's this number and here's this number. They have a point of view that they want you to buy into. So they'll show you these numbers and tell you this is good and leave these numbers totally out. or vice versa. Okay? So you have to be really careful, because a lot of those folks on TV say, oh, I'm a journalist, I'm a journalist, I'm a journalist, and they're not. All they are is telling you their opinion, biased by the facts they want to give you, not all of them. All right? Back in chapter 1, remember, we called this the lie of omission. So this is what's going on, because they're not reporters, they're not journalists, they're basically political hacks for whatever party or whatever the owner of the station wants them to do. So that's what's going on. All right, so even though the deficit in the fourth year was $200 billion, our debt ballooned to $1.1 trillion. All right, now debts or deficits and surpluses, we talked about this planned and unplanned. What we mean by planned is, in 2002, these are real numbers, the government went together and figured out, we think we're going to get this much in revenue, and we think we're going to get this much in taxes. And they think that because they believe unemployment's going to be this for the year, and GDP growth is going to be this for the year. So with all of that in play, they figure they're going to have a surplus of $231 billion. That's the plan. That's what goes through Congress, that's what everybody rubber stamps, and we're good to go. Problem is then we go through the year and things happen. Unemployment was higher, GDP growth was lower, we came up with a deficit of $158 billion versus a surplus of $231. This is the plan, this is real life. That's what unplanned means, real life. In '97, the plan was for $125 billion deficit. At the end of '97, we only had a $22 billion deficit. Why? Lower unemployment and more workers, more tax revenue. So that's all this is talking about there. Now, when we talk about getting involved, there's what we call fiscal policy activism. Activism means we need the government to get involved. Now, just remember, government involvement is necessary, but government involvement can also cause us to slaughter 7 million hogs and then burn the carcasses so nobody can eat the meat, or have total shortages and they'll never go away, such as housing in certain places around the country. So activists can be good, but too much can be bad. Also, a non-activist basically saying no government involvement at all, this leads to people being allowed to infringe on other people's personal property. Right? My example earlier being, I can now dump my leftover chemicals in your yard because I can do whatever I want with them. So we can't have no activism. So again, it's kind of how far do we go from zero to full government involvement? Enough to nudge, but not enough to mess up. That's kind of the key. Where is that? Who knows? That's why you keep looking at it and trying to figure it out. All right, Social Security, healthcare, and interest. 82% of our spending growth is those three areas. And those are the ones we don't vote on: Social Security and healthcare. And the interest just depends on how much we have to borrow. 82% of our spending growth. And we don't do that. We try to figure out how to cut $22 trillion debt with only 18% of our spending. Not a good deal. Now, does owing money create problems? Well, if you borrowed it from a loan shark, yes, it would create some problems if you're not paying it back. Right now, in 2018, 29% of that $20 trillion back then anyway, was owned by foreign countries, okay? And if you look, 6.5% owed to China. I didn't realize that Japan has the next highest at 4.8%. And then Belgium, Ireland, and Luxembourg, the three little itty-bitty countries in Europe, they own 3.2% of our debt. And then it goes for all the rest of it. This 12% is the rest of the world. Or in other words, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This would be the other 175 nations in the world own 12% of our debt. And guess what? Almost 40% is owned by we the people and various businesses and institutions in the United States. Social Security Trust Fund owns 13%. Federal Reserve, Civil Service, and the Military Retirement Fund. Yay! That's where I get my retirement check from. Theoretically, we could go ahead and forgive that whole debt because we own it. So we could go ahead and tell the government, you know what? We're going to go ahead and forgive, 71% of $21.5 billion, or 21.5, should say $1 trillion, not billion, my bad. So $21.5 trillion we're going to forgive, that 71%. Boom, it goes away. All of a sudden, our debt looks a heck of a lot more manageable. Now we're down to about $7 trillion, not $21 trillion. But see, here's the problem. Now, let's just, one of these in here, these institutions, let's say it's the city of Jacksonville. And let's say every year they're getting a check from the government for $100,000 of interest because of the loan we made to the government. We write it off. We go ahead and say, put the big X, rip it up, and let the government go ahead and not have to worry about paying that money and all that anymore. So here's the problem. Jacksonville now has a $100,000 revenue hole that they have to fill. So we're either raising taxes or firing police officers. Right? Because that's the only way we're going to fill that $100,000 that we were getting from the government. That's why that won't happen. Okay. Let me see here. Oh, by the way, in 2016, we actually, percentage-wise, the rest of the world owned more. But because the dollar value increased, even though the percentage went down, there's still more dollars out there that we owe. All right, now go ahead and get the last of the handouts, the Government Involvement Debt Problems sheet. And let's take a look at some of the problems. The first of the problems is what we call crowding out. Now, this is government or households and businesses. We all want a product. So here's what happens. Whoops. If government wants it, they're going to go ahead and get it. Households and business, we take second fiddle if the government needs it. So let's say there's 100,000 units of this product and each side wants 75,000. So the government gets 75,000 of that 100. That leaves 25,000 left over for this group, and this group wanted 75,000. That all of a sudden becomes a big shortage. And what happens when we have a shortage? Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Yep, prices go up. And 2/3 of the people don't get the product. So here's where we talk about a crowding out problem. Government can crowd out households and businesses from the market, make prices go up, and that'll go ahead and reduce the standard of living. All right. How much government involvement? Again, we look at just enough to fix, but not enough to mess up. This messes up. All right, we talked about those earlier. Here's the crowding out that's going on. This is what we're looking at. The government gets it. This is crowding out of resource market. If the government wants it, there's less left over. Prices go up for the households. Here's the capital market. In other words, being able to borrow money. Government needs more and more and more. It leaves less and less and less for businesses or households. Prices go up. Or the product, and that's the one we just talked about. Government gets more, less for businesses and households. Prices go up. In all three categories, standard of living of the individual, in other words, us, goes down. Now the second is expansionary bias. Right? We took a look at fiscal policy, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. If we go ahead and use contractionary fiscal policy and we make people pay more and more money, all of a sudden the money we have left over shrinks. We don't like that, so we go ahead and elect somebody else. So there's a bias to do expansionary policy only. Right? We don't want to get fired, we want to stay elected. Now, there's also time lags that are involved. Recognize the problem, get a plan for action, and then implement the plan. So let's see what happened. Time lags. The Great Recession, right, of 2009 or 2007 to 2009. It started in December of 2007, but it wasn't really discovered, and really it is a real recession until a year later. So now we have a whole year that we weren't taking action on a recession. Then there's the implementation lag. We have to come up with a plan, right? This would kind of be like a law going through Congress, and remember going back what it takes to create a law, and you got everybody, this is all of a sudden, we're not playing nice with each other. It's my way or the highway on either side. So it's going to be a long time to get the implementation through. And it took about 9 months to do that. So first off, we had a year out, and then the implementation, getting the plan, was about another year, and then we had to put it into effect. Now, sometimes it might take 3 to 5 years to go through the whole economy. Well, so it started in 2007. It was over in June of 2009. We discovered in 2008, that's when we started the plan. And then we put the program into place kind of like later in 2009. In other words, basically the recession was over, now the plan's in place. And then it's going to take a while to work. But we don't need it anymore because the recession's over. And the plan wasn't all that good either. That's why we kind of had a problem for, we almost had what might be called a lost decade. Our economy barely grew, and some of you don't remember back that because that was 10 years ago. But it wasn't good. It was not a good time. People weren't getting raises. Jobs were not improving salaries. And President Obama actually came out and said, hey, we may need to get used to this. This is the new economy. Well, it wasn't the new economy. It was just the wrong plan at that time. We also have accuracy in numbers. Remember, we had the planned and the unplanned, what we think is going to happen, what actually does. That can create a problem with the debt. Also, we talk about accuracy in numbers. The Affordable Care Act, the original cost scored by the Office of Budget and Management was going to be $940 billion. But after a couple of years, it was $2.7 trillion. Now, the idea behind it, improve quality, reduce costs, and increase access. This is good. But the problem was, this is the plan they came out with. Here's the doctors, here's the patients right here, that's us. Here's the doctors over here. All of this is government. So we now have red tape, and we got to pay everybody in that system for the red tape. So plan wasn't exactly all that high. We also have conflicting goals. The more government or less government. Right? We had President Obama's tenure in office. Bigger government, less personal choice. And let's not just put all this on President Obama either. During President Bush and the previous President Bush, the government grew bigger too. So it just didn't grow as big. Or smaller government and more personal choice. So this is when we start talking about the conflicting goals, when we elect a president that wants to go in one direction and the economy had been going the other direction, or a Congress that wants to go in one direction and the economy had been going in the other direction. That's where we start having problems with trying to get rid of the debt. Now, can we pay it off? Well, for all you accountants out there, the first question would be, do we have enough assets to pay the liabilities? And I would say absolutely yes. If we sold all the oil wells in Alaska to everybody else in the world, we'd probably get enough money to go ahead and pay off the debt. So yeah, we do have assets to do that. So we could pay it off if we wanted to give all of our oil away. Is it going to be a burden on future generations? Sooner or later, somebody's going to have to pay the bill. We just don't know when. So it could be a problem, but it's not one right now. Foreign-owned debt. Can that cause problems? Yes, and it does. And there were a couple of times we've sent people over to China to talk to them about how they're doing their economy and how it's messing with the rest of the world. And China basically told us, you know, up yours, go fix your economy, get rid of your debt. You're the biggest debtor nation in the world. Quit being a deadbeat. So, yeah, it can create some problems. Can we afford the interest payments? Well, we have been so far, even with all the government shutdowns we've had, we always pay the interest payments. So, is it manageable today? As long as countries are still going to loan us money, and as long as folks inside the United States are going to loan the government money, yes, we don't have that problem. But as the interest rates start getting higher, it's going to be more and more and more, and could turn into a big problem. Alright, so that's what the sheet should look like. And that's the end of this section. But what we're going to do now is show you what the Social Security paper does. Now, the first thing you need to do is, at the back of the Fiscal Policy chapter, read the last word section. Right? It's about Social Security and Medicare. Then, you're going to basically put together something like 16 paragraphs. So this is one that's going to take a little while. Question number 1. Does Social Security need to be modified? Answer from the article. List the bullets explaining the problems with Social Security in the article. And where it says 4-sentence paragraph, remember that's a 4-bullet paragraph. Okay? Number 2, does Medicare need to be modified? Answer from the article. List the bullets explaining problems with Medicare. And again, it says 4-sentence paragraph, 4-bullet paragraph. Number 3, or section 3, list all the options that the article presents to resolve Social Security and Medicare. So you're going to have a 3A with a whole bunch of Social Security bullets, and a 3B with a whole bunch of Medicare bullets. Now, we got blue here because you're going to go do some research. You're going to go online and you're going to find at least 3 options that the Democrats are offering to resolve the Social Security problem. Right? List them as bullets, but put the URL where you found that bullet. Okay? Which of those 3 bullets are going to go ahead and solve the problem, do you think? So 4A is